Salve omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial, chapter 21, third and fourth conjugations, present passive system. As your book points out, this was introduced earlier in the book, namely chapter 18. So you may want to go back and look at chapter 18 for conceptual understanding. I did bring up for us what the concept is that we need to discern, namely between indicative and passive. And as your book points out, with the passive endings, we simply substitute the aris tuor munmeni nuntur for our osmos tisnit. As always, there are exceptions in the spelling that you will need to discern in order to translate the verb correctly. But take a look at this as well as chapter 18. Don't forget latintutorial.com does a nice job as well, but this is one of the limitations of online instruction, is namely answering questions that you may have in a spontaneous way. You'll have to either email with questions, being specific as possible, come see me during one of my German classes, or review the chapter and do some independent reading online using the internet. With that said, this is a fairly straightforward chapter if we note those endings, aris tuor munmeni nuntur. You can see there are some, as noted, some exceptions, largely with one of the vowels, which changes the meaning. And as your book points out, we also need to pay attention to the macrons, which will change the tense of the verb in question from present to future, or even imperfect or past continuous. We also have what's called the present passive infinitive, which simply means to be. There's our, we'll just kind of back it up a bit. So to indicates the infinitive. The passive part of it is be, and then we have the past tense or perfect form of the word at the end here. So here they give us a couple examples of a basic infinitive, dire, which means to hear, but then we can change that infinitive to a passive in the present tense by adding to be. But Latin, once again, will change the ending, whereas English tends to add words. And so that's another concept in this chapter. This can sound tricky, but in practice, especially the positioning of it and the context of the sentences in which this is used, it's somewhat intuitive. All right. As your book points out, you have now been provided a synopsis of regular verbs of all four conjugations in the indicative mood. Later, we will learn the subjunctive mood, but knowing the indicative can take you pretty far in your mastery of Latin. And here's a paradigm that they give us for the verb ago, which means to go. So we get the word agenda. So that's pretty satisfying to know how much Latin you have learned already. Here we have our vocabulary words. You'll want to read these because these will be on the test, which will be the week after next, as I will indicate in an email. We don't have a lot of words relative to modern languages, for example, which tend to give maybe 50 to 75 words per chapter. But these are important words to know. And once again, please learn the genitive forms for the nouns, because that will tell you what declension a noun belongs to, as well as the possible translations. So here, casa can mean house, cottage, or hut, depending on the context. And it's where we get the word casino in English. So the words in italics are words derived or that come from these Latin words. All right, so take a look at that. Don't forget the companion website of Wheelox does have a pronunciation guide, if necessary, for these words. All right, let's go into our Sententiae antiquae. Let me pull up one more helpful chart for us here. And as noted previously, it's probably a good idea to do the self-tutorial exercises, at least some of them, maybe the odds or the evens, in the back of the book before tackling these, because it sets the stage for this vocabulary and this grammar concept. All right, so we're going to start off with Publilius Syrus, who is the author of this one, Numquam Periculum Sine Periculo Vincitor. So here is our aris tur mumini nuntur. So we can see that there's the tur, and so we need to recognize that this is in the passive voice. As noted in previous lessons, probably last semester, oftentimes we can translate or read the passive with the indicative in English, just because English, for a variety of reasons, which we can't get into, does not prefer stylistically the passive, whereas Latin does. German does too, by the way, so do other languages, but English not so much. So this is simply just working through the vocabulary. So once we look up the words, either in a dictionary, the back of the book, or Whitaker's Words, we'll probably have something like this: never, danger, without, danger, conquer. But then we need to go back and study the endings a little bit more carefully and then come up with a translation. Periculum is a neuter noun. So again, I brought up our Whitaker's Words. I'm not going to do this for all the words, but this is probably something you should be doing until you master the vocabulary of the endings. So here we can see it's periculum. N means neuter, not noun, and then gives us a variety of possible usages. Only the context will tell you how it's being used. Here are the possible translations: danger, peril, trial, attempt, risk, responsibility for damage, liability. In this case, we're just going to go with danger. And so danger is never to be conquered without danger. So let me go ahead and write that for us, and then I will explain it in a little bit more detail. Fairly straightforward. Periculum is danger. Is numquam means never, to be conquered. So there's our passive voice right there. And sine means without, and sine is always followed by the ablative. So sure enough, since this is a neuter noun of the second declension ablative singular is o. So periculo, that explains that ending right there. So that one's fairly straightforward, but just shows you how much Latin you've already learned. It does require some solid understanding of Latin grammar and the inflected nature of Latin, i.e. the endings. All right, let's move on to duo, Novios. Now, as your book points out, Novios is the name of a person. In fact, it says right here, this is by Martial, who, along with Juvenal, is most famous for his satire. The context for this is the overpopulation relative to the land of Rome and how it led to certain tenements, or nowadays we would call them apartments, that were kind of shoddy, if not dirty, in Martial's view. So it kind of is that contrast between life in the city versus life on the land, which is a common trope throughout history in terms of the different virtues and vices of each. So with that said, let's go through the vocabulary. So this is the method I recommend. Just is make sure we know the vocabulary first. So here we have novios is vicinity, my, and hand, right, touch, from, windows, my, is able. But then we need to go back and study these words more carefully to identify the endings, and then we can go on to the syntax and reading and translation. So this is a good example of what's required in Latin and how it's so different from other foreign languages. It kind of gives you everything at once, gives you vocabulary, gives you grammar, gives you syntax, gives you reading, gives you history, and then trying to work your way through those different levels of linguistic, cultural, and historical meanings is the brilliance of Latin, but also one of its challenges. Sometimes we don't know what it means until we know what it means, and whereas other things are more incremental, perhaps. So with that said, vincinus means neighbor. It's where we get words like vicinity. Vicinity is something nearby. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little backslash here and say my neighbor, or Novius is my neighbor. We can actually just read that fairly straightforward. Novius is my neighbor. And now here's where we have to, English likes the verb next. And he is able to be touched. So here we have the modal verb. And here is actually an example of the perfect passive infinitive, which we noted earlier. You can notify it by its ending. Once again, that since this is a new concept, it might be a little easier just to use Whitaker's words, but you can see this is the present passive infinitive. So not perfect, I think I said perfect. Present passive infinitive. So with that said, is that, and he is able, so we know it's third person singular because it ends in est. So it's not possum, which would mean I am able, or potest, you are able, but he is able. So he is able to be touched. This is where we get the word like tango and tangent. And so I'm going to go ahead and write that down. This, of course, could also be translated as he can be touched. He is able to be touched. Now here we have manu dextra. This is where we get the words like a word such as dexterity, manus, manual, something with hand. But notice the endings here. These are both ablative endings. This is fourth declension. This is first declension. So if I just look at my chart here, you can see the manu dextre indicating the ablative. So we probably need some prepositional phrase. So I'm going to go with my right hand. Latin tends not to use possessive adjectives such as my, your, but the context suggests my. So Novius is my neighbor, and he is able to be touched with my right hand. Also, just reminds us, one of the tricky things about Latin, it often is missing words, whereas English tends to use words. So as we go from the English to the Latin, we have to supply those English words because Latin is more periphrastic than English. Meos et mano, and with my right hand, and is able to be touched with my right hand from my windows. So de means from, like devolve, and then it's always followed by the ablative. So sure enough, fenistra is first declension. So we're going to go first declension ablative plural, which is is, and we can confirm that by looking at that right here. Just because de is always followed rather by the ablative. It is able to be touched with my hand from, again, a commentary on the overcrowdedness of ancient Rome. Let's move on to tres. Nonne judices jubibunt hunc propter scalera et vincula duci et ad mortem rapi. So here is a saying by Cicero, probably a reference to Catiline, which we read earlier when Cicero was consul. Catiline had begun a conspiracy, which we talked about last time. Nonne is somewhat common in Latin, and it says it introduces a question which anticipates the answer yes. So an example of that would be, surely you don't mean that, but you do mean it, but it's sort of rhetorically understood that the answer is going to be yes. I recommend translating none like in British English by saying surely. So since this is fairly common, I recommend just when you see none, it's going to mean surely, and you'll see it's a rhetorical question suggesting yes. Judices is the subject. We know that from the context, followed by the verb, which is also in the third person plural. So this is where we get the word judges, judex. Remember, there was no J in classical Latin. But if you put a J here, you can kind of see the word judge comes from this Latin word. So surely the judges will order. Jubebunt is order coming from UBO. And so you can see here's the present active indicative. Here we have a different tense. And so we can simply type that in as well. And you can see it's future active indicative third person. And it means to order, tell, command, direct, enjoin, and some other possibilities. So we're going to go with the simplest one, order. The judges are issuing an order, or hypothetically, they will. So surely the judges will order him. Hunc means him. Again, probably a reference to Catiline. And then as we work our way through this sentence, propter means because or on account of, always followed by the accusative. This actually is a word we've seen before. It's where we get the word scurrilous in English. It is it is a neuter noun. So this actually is neuter plural, which you can see here. Where is our neuter plural here? Yes, propter followed by the accusative. So there's our A right there. So scalera, because propter is always followed by the accusative case. Surely the judges will order him because, probably say because of his crimes. So I'm going to read that here. Or on account of, because of. So here's another example where Latin uses two words, but because here we have a preposition and then the possessive adjective. So Latin, in general, tends not to use these kinds of words because the context will make it clear what's meant, whereas English tends to. And then surely judges will order him because of his crimes. Here we have the present passive infinitive again, to be led in chains. So let's go ahead and write that here. So here's one of our new grammar concepts, duce. You can see by the ending, if you go back early in the book, if it ends in I, once again, if we're not quite sure what this means, we can use our Rhetoricus word as an A. So there's our present passive infinitive once again, to be led. So we got to put it in the infinitive form. So to lead, to led in this case is the correct grammar. And to be taken to his death is how that reads right there. Oops, I almost forgot the question mark. So this one, it's not tricky, but this one will once again sort of require careful working through the sentence and really knowing what cases and what endings these words are in order to understand the sentence accurately, and of course to translate it into English accurately. So I've said many, many times, going back to Latin 101, this is really the key, at least for our level of Latin, unless you're going to become a classicist. This is really the key for learning Latin in any serious kind of sense, is we need to know these endings, and we need to know the cases, and we need to know how to translate them with our parts of speech. So we need to know a little bit, if not quite a bit, of English grammar and the terminology that English grammar uses in order to actually understand Latin. If not, we're probably, we may memorize it, but we haven't really understood anything. All right, moving on to number 4. Ultra aetes bellis civilibus territor et Roma ipsa suis viribus delitor. So here's Horace, 65 to 8 BC. We have some new vocabulary, at least relative to other chapters in the book. So ultra aetes, this looks like it's plural, but it's actually in the singular. And so this is simply a matter of knowing our vocabulary, but it does mean year. Can also mean in this case sort of like a period of time. So if we go back to the context here, is, let's see, they don't really give us that either. So ultra aetes, so another time. That's what I'm going to go with. In fact, I'm going to look in my hard copy of my Wheelocks to see if they give us an alternative translation. Otherwise, I can already tell this is going to be stilted in terms of its meaning. Here they have summer, but then they have indicated as ending. No, here we go. Sorry. Period of life, life, age, time. So here's a good example where the Whitaker's words gives us different translations. So sometimes we have to look in the back of our book just because how this word is being used isn't indicated necessarily in the Whitaker's words. So I'm looking in the vocabulary in the back of the book, and it says aetes, period of life, life, age, time, age. So I'm gonna go with time for, because I think that's the sense of it. So ultra means a former age. So this one is a little bit tricky in terms of the grammar. The reason for this is with Latin so much is using great authors. So Horace is a great poet, a great author. So you can imagine translating Shakespeare into other languages is going to be super tricky. Well, it's no different with Latin because these are all based on great Latin writers, i.e. the examples in our book. So translating it into everyday English sometimes can be quite tricky. So, and then we have territor, which they give us what that means here. Once again, it is being used in the passive form. So there's our tour. And so we're simply going to follow that right there. And so is being worn out. Okay. Or let's see, what is it? A former age is you're going to see this one loses a little bit in translation. This is where probably in English already we would say the former age was worn out. But that's just because of the differences between English and grammar. But the meaning is still clear. But again, I tend to keep it as literal as possible so we can master the grammar. So another age is being worn out. Now here we have the ablative again. So here we have is and civilibus. So let's take a look at bellum, which is war. And I think actually this chart actually has war as, yeah, there we go. So this one helps. So bellum means war. Think of antebellum South. So here we have the ablative plural. And so that indicates right there bellis. So there's the is. But then we have the civilibus, because this is a third declension adjective. So we put it all together, it means by civil wars, but there's their is ibus. So let's go ahead and write this down. A former age is being worn out by. This is probably a reference, as you know, most of the first century Rome was in political strife, if not outright civil war, leading to the assassination of Julius Caesar. And so this is probably what Horace is referring to. Remember, Horace died in 8 BC, so he did survive the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Roman Imperium. And that's probably the context for this. And Rome itself literally is being deleted, but probably destroyed is the better translation. And Rome itself is being destroyed by its own strengths. So Rome itself, Rome ipsa, is being destroyed, literally is being deleted, and then by its own strengths. So here we have variable suis, just because this is masculine, so we're going to need the suis, but then still the ibus for the ending there. The ablative, as we've noted many times, is the trickiest of cases. A lot of times you might just have to memorize these as set phrases, because you can see that they do have ablative endings, but still identifying that and then translating that takes a little bit of time. And so hence this online instruction to help you with that. All right. All right, so we noted this is probably, if I were translating this and publishing it, I would not put it in this format, but since this is a language class, I tend to keep these translations and explanations as literal as possible so we can learn the fundamentals, and then if you were to move on in your Latin, beyond what we offer, then questions of style would come into play, but that is probably at the 400 level. Moving on to number 5, Quinque by Cicero. At amicitia nullo loco excluditur numquam est intempestiva aut sinistra multa beneficio continent. So it's not a long sentence, but still has a lot of words. But let's use the punctuation, the end punctuation, in this case a semicolon. Here we have another semicolon, so we can break it apart or chunk it to make it more manageable. So let's start with the first part right here. But friendship is excluded from no place. That's actually, I think, a lot easier if you break it apart. But friendship is excluded from no place. Let's take a look at this here. At means but. There are many forms of but, including, as you know, said means but at means but. So, one of the beauties of Latin, but also the challenges, yet again, is the vocabulary. It can mean a lot of things depending on the context. And so we just have to look up the words. Amicitia, which we've had before, does mean friendship, so it is the subject in this sentence. We need to find a subject. And then here's our aris tuum meninuntur. So literally is being excluded. So here's a good example where, much more so than the last one, I think is being excluded. We're just going to drop the being because English doesn't like that. But friendship is excluded. So let's just keep it in that form there. And then here we have the ablative of separation, nolo loco. We take a look at second declension, nolo, loco, ablative. So from, coming up with that preposition is probably the key here. From no place. Moving on here, numquam we've had in number 1, so that means never. It never is intempestiva. So here they help us, it means untimely. So let's go ahead and write that down. Here we get the word temporal, so it has something to do with time. And then the in often means un in Latin. So it is never untimely. Let's go ahead and write that down. It is never untimely, or, out means or sinistra. Sinistra, interesting enough, can mean left-handed, but in this case, it means, let's go with improper. If you want to say adverse or inauspicious, that's fine too, but I'm going to go just with improper here. It is never untimely or improper. And then it contains many benefits. So if we break it apart using the punctuation, I think it's a lot easier. So it contains is where we get words like continent. It contains many benefits. As you may recall, Cicero wrote a famous essay on friendship, De Amicitia, in 44 BC, following Aristotle and Plato on that topic. It's definitely worth reading. Friendship is probably pretty important for life, contributes to happiness, according to Cicero, Plato, and Aristotle, but we don't even need to rely on them. We can infer from our own lives that friendship indeed is one of the jewels of life. Moving on to number 6. Futura scire non possunt. Literally, the futures are not able to be known. So let me go ahead and write this literally and then kind of show you. So I wrote this literally, one, because it's short, but two, it illustrates one of the unique challenges in Latin is even when we have a translation, assuming we're doing it our own and not relying on Google Translate, which is somebody else doing it, the futures are not able to be known. That sounds weird. And so here's we have to kind of go back and say, okay, how do we... now, if you wrote that on a test, I would give you credit for it because that's what it says. The futures are not able to be known. So there's our present passive infinitive again. But it probably means that either the future is not able to be known or future things are not able to be known. So you would have a couple options here if you wanted to say future things are not. The advantage of this is, in my experience, sometimes students get confused as to why there's different translations, although it's really not that confusing. But the advantage of this is then we keep it in the plural form because it is in the plural form. We can tell that by the verb here, which is possunt. The not disadvantage, but then saying future things is, we often learn in English not to use the word thing because it's not very descriptive, but in this case it works. We could also just say the future is not able to be known, which probably is the best translation, just because it's probably the best English of the three. So the point to be made here is there's always possibilities if you were to look at the great works in literature and translation, even in English, if you were to look at English translations of Homer or Virgil or whomever, you would see many, many different translations through the years by many prominent writers and authors and scholars. And so it just depends on what the standard usage is in terms of what may sound the best. So maybe this last one is the best, but then we need to be mindful that it does change the verb to the singular, which we don't have here. We don't have here potest, we have possunt. Moving on to number 7. Principio ipse mundus deorum hominum quae causa factus est, et quae in eos sunt, e apparatus sunt ad fructum hominum. Another slightly long sentence, so we're probably going to have to look up the words, so you might have something like this. Beginning, itself, world, gods, men, reason, made is, and what in it are. Those made are for fruit, men. But then we got to go back and massage it over, think more carefully about the words, about the endings, and then try to work our way through the sentence. Like any problem, takes a little bit of trial and error. So principio, like in the Bible, in the beginning was the word principio. So we're going to go think of principle. So in the beginning. Another good example, Latin uses one word. English, we have three words. In the beginning, mundus means the world. So the world itself, so this one we're going to go through slowly. Think of mundus, where we get words like mundane, so kind of the world. The contrast here, of course, would be with the profane, to use some theological references. In the beginning, the world itself. Now here, your book, this chapter actually points this out in your vocab. This one we need to be able to recognize as as a participle. And so it's not is made, but was made. And so one of the challenges with perfect passive is, and your book points this out, is we have to be able to see this as a pair. It's no different than English when we say have gone or have worked. We know in English that those two words go together, but we probably don't think about it. Well, Latin is the same way. Is we have to be able to recognize this as a pair. Otherwise, we're going to translate it or read it in the present tense, which would be wrong. And so you would lose points on the test for putting it in the wrong tense. But then we have this cause, which, as your book points out, is used with the genitive. So cause, where we get the word cause, can be translated as for the sake of or because of, would be a couple options there. But then we got to work backwards. Here it's in the genitive because that's the rule with this verb, or rather with this word. So here we have hominum, which is third declension genitive plural, because man is third declension. So there it is, hominum. So and so then when we look at this other word here, we have deorum, which is God's, because God, and God's is second declension, so second declension genitive plural, deorum. So we put it all together is, in the beginning, the earth itself was made for the sake of men and gods. What's the context for this? Well, for the ancients, there was no monotheism, and in mythology, nature and time and fate were much more powerful than the gods, and certainly much, much, much more powerful than human beings. And so that Cicero was following, this ancient naturalism, if you will. And then it gets a little bit tricky here. Et quae in eo sunt, and literally in those things which are in it. And we're talking about in the world. So this is tricky because this is a relative pronoun. Only the context will tell you. We did have this in chapter 17, relative pronouns, if you wanted to go back and review. But this one is a little bit tricky, so maybe just rely on the help I'm giving you here. And those things which are in it. And so most of the time when we talk, we don't say those things which. So that's three words, whereas Latin just has one word, which makes it even that much trickier. But that's what it's saying here, reference back to the mundus. And those things which are in it. So let's go ahead and just write that down. Could also read that as and that which is in it, but then because then we don't have to, then we're leaving, because then we can read quae as that, and we don't have to worry about coming up with things which, but then we're changing the verb to the singular is, which if you don't really understand the context, then you probably don't understand why you're changing this to is. And like anything else, you got to be careful when you start changing sources without knowing why. And so probably keeping it literal, but knowing more Latin. Here, you can see how this is a tricky clause here, is the conundrum that we're faced with this. And those things which are in it, parata sunt. So here's another perfect passive. Have been provided rather, and those things which are in it, they have been provided, or they have been prepared. So I'm going to go provided. So they have been prepared. They have been prepared, literally for the fruit of men, but maybe for the benefit of human beings. You can see even Google doesn't like the grammar here because it's a kind of a paraphrastic sentence, but we're not going to worry too much about that since we're doing Latin, not English grammar. So we look at this again. This one is a little bit tricky because it has these pronouns and then these relative pronouns, which makes this, I think, the tricky part. I think the first part is pretty straightforward once we learn that causa means for the sake of, de orum hominum, but the quae and the ea, I think those are even though it's only two words, I think that those are very tricky to translate without lots of practice. And being able to recognize this as the perfect passive also is going to be important. These last three words, where we get the word fruit, for the benefit of men, is pretty straightforward. Fructum is fourth declension, so since ad is always followed by the accusative, so fourth declension accusative. Fructum. Actually, they don't have, let's see, that may not be the case. Let me look this up here. Let's see here. Yeah, this is interesting because ad should be followed by the accusative always, as you can see, preposition plus the accusative, but without doing some more research as to why this form is not following that rule. Because here, here it is. You can tell I'm drinking my coffee still. So it's in the singular, not the plural. I was looking on the wrong part here. So yeah, so ad fructum. So there's our um following right here, and then here's our genitive plural, third declension, which I think we mentioned earlier. So there's the plural hominum. Moving on to number 8, we just got a couple more. Xenophon, as your book points out, is the name of a famous Greek historian. And it reads here, Quam copiose ad Xenophonte agricultura lauditoret eo libro qui economicus et scribitur. So the Greeks, as you know, created so many of our concepts of meaning and form and science and so forth. Here's where we get the word economics. So that's kind of interesting. Quam means how. Do they have it? No. But if you looked it up, it's kind of an adverbial, like how interesting. But then we have copiose, which here they tell us what it means, fully or copiously. So let's keep it literally. So we're just going to go how fully in this case. So remember, if it's in italics, we can use that as a translation. So let's go ahead and write this down while it's still fresh in our minds. How fully. And as is often the case in Latin, we're trying to get a sense of the subject and verb, since English likes the subject and verb early in the sentence, as well as the intelligibility of language. So far we don't really have that, so we're trying to tune into that because that's going to make it a lot easier. So agricultura is indeed our subject. So, how fully agriculture laudetur is literally is being praised, because once again there's our aristur, so it's in the passive, but we can probably put that just in the indicative, or rather drop the being. So how fully agriculture is praised. How fully agriculture is praised, and how fully agriculture is praised, and then by Xenophon. So A is by in this case, so there it's always followed by the ablative. So sure enough, third declension ablative singular is E. So we're going to translate that as by Xenophon. How fully agriculture is praised by Xenophon in that book. So in El Libro, it's where we get the word library. So in that book. So you can see them for me, I tend to work my way through these sentences. It's just the way Latin is. So try to chunk it, try to find phrases, try to find stopping points or end punctuation to help you with that. So in that book. And then here, excribitor is entitled. So this actually is the present tense, even though it has the be. That's just because that's part of the root or stem of the verb. Once again, it's in the passive, in that book entitled Economics. In fact, we could even keep it in the original Latin if we wanted to. In that book. They have a qui here, so I will say in that book, which is entitled. So the qui is referring back to book. So in that book. So this chapter does, in addition to the passive, it does sort of require, it looks like, some mastery or comprehension of the relative pronouns. So here's the qui. We talked earlier about the qui earlier, and remember this was in chapter 17. These tend to be tricky in learning foreign languages, whether it's Latin, German, whatever. And so I can tell you it's not just in Latin where these are tricky. My German students struggle with this too. Just because if we don't know what that which or who or whom is referring to, you can imagine that in a foreign language, oftentimes we don't know what it's referring to because our language is so fragmented in terms of its understanding. It can be tricky to make the connection with what it's talking about. But in this case, it is referring back to the antecedent, which is book. But these, like a lot of things in Latin, take a little bit of time. Moving on to number 9. So we have an easy one here. So vulgus means the people. Can mean the vulgar too, like common people. So vulgus, can look this up. Common people. So we'll just go with that. If you want to say the herd, but again, these are all sort of pejorative terms, which we can't really discuss that over this format, or maybe. So we're just going to go with the common people. Keep our translation literal. And then volt means want. And then here is the present passive infinitive. Again, it means to be deceived. So the common people want to be deceived. What does that mean? Well, maybe they're busy working, maybe they don't have time to think for themselves, and you can sort of fill in quite sensibly what that means. Here we have a nice one from the book of Job, Old Testament. Where are knowledge and wisdom to be found? So that's a nice one. A little like where we get the word invention, which is a kind of finding or discovery. Scientia is where we get the word science. I think we pointed out in previous lessons, but in Latin it often means knowledge, where science indicates more of a method in its modern usage. So where are knowledge and wisdom to be found? So we had some tricky ones that started off really easy, then we had some challenging ones, but these last couple are fairly straightforward once we know the vocab. And the last one, where we get the word truth. So truth is often literally hardworking, or truth is often too much stressed, or probably the idea is that it's sort of involved in labors to try to keep it true and not fall to deception or misinterpretation or ideology or whatnot. So truth is often stressed is probably the best way to look at that. When you're tired, you're stressed, you're exhausted. So truth is often, or even too often, maybe distressed might even be better. If we look at some possibilities of laborat, this is where we get the word labor. Truth is often oppressed, so let's go with being distressed. So I'm going to go all the way in here. So truth is often, or too often, distressed. So we'll go with that one there. And then the last clause here, it is never, literally, it is never being extinguished. So even though it's under stress, presumably as long as there's human beings and consciousness and life, according to Livy, it will still exist in some faint way, even though we might not be conscious of it, or it might not be obvious to us in our current social and political configurations. So it is never being extinguished. But I think because of English, we'll leave out the being. All right, so as always, let me know if you have questions about that. We're going to move on to Virgil's Messianic Ecloge on page 173. I'm actually going to do this separately because this one, the Latin, is a little bit trickier in parts. You may have noticed we don't have a lot of Virgil, I've mentioned this before, in the Wheelox, even though Virgil perhaps is Rome's greatest author along with Ovid. Certainly a literary writer. One reason is that his Latin is a little bit tricky to translate because of its poetics. So I think we'll stop here, and then I'll do this as a separate video for next week. As I will point out in your email, your test will be the week after next. So we're not looking at next week, but the week after. So you will basically, do this lesson this week. I'll give you another lesson on Virgil's Messianic Eclogue next week, and then your test will be the following week, and you'll come to D-Rich on a time that I will note, and you'll have to sit for the exam, and it will be on chapters 19, 20, and 21. As always, please email me if you have questions. Valete.